In this audio, we will be discussing the various ways in which U.S. immigration laws have affected and reflected society during various times in a sociological way. Law is defined in sociological terms as, quote, the whole of legal norms in a society as well as the practices, a definition we defined in lecture. Law does not necessarily refer to actual laws and legislation, but also includes the unspoken ways that people treat or think about each other in a way that consequently affects others' lives. This can have drastic effects on how people consider or assign value to those of a different race, religion, sexuality, or a different birthplace.
Laws reflect the values held by society at a given time. As those values change, the laws will change to reflect them. Laws promoting or discouraging norms and practices by citizens and government workers, i.e., police, politicians, judges, etc., also change over time. It allows one to see the progression of societal change over time.
Media attention is a major driving force behind public opinion, and with the immigration debate, it is clear that the narrative surrounding it is negative. Shows like Border Wars does a great job of demonizing and criminalizing people trying to cross the Mexican-American border. The intro alone portrays undocumented immigrants as criminal and ruthless, which is not the case. But when the general public sees stuff like this, it reinforces stereotypes that can lead to a more militarized border patrol, which is already happening, and racialized legal violence.
While undocumented immigrants feel the brunt of anti-immigration policies and sentiments, even American citizens can be hurt by these policies. The term Aryan citizen, coined by Chavez, was made to describe citizens who are American by birth but who are still seen as foreign by white American culture norms. This is important because it shows how some people feel like outsiders in the country they were born in because American ideal citizen is defined as white.
Continuing with Megan's line of thought, the United States is biased when it comes to who is seen as being able to become American. Shows like Border Wars and the current president have spoken poorly about immigrants, calling them criminals and rapists, based solely on the color of their skin and the country of origin. In fact, statistics have shown that undocumented immigrants are usually the victims of crime, not the perpetrators. While the countries targeted as being undesirable for immigration purposes has changed over time, the overall message is unchanged. Some people are not white enough or American enough to be allowed entry or become citizens. One of the first U.S. immigration laws was the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This barred Chinese immigrants from entering the United States in attempts to allow more job opportunities for American citizens. It was extremely racialized and created an us versus them mentality of immigrants taking U.S. jobs. This fear is still seen in today's arguments for stricter immigration laws.
This idea can also be seen in the 1924 national origin quotas, which heavily favored certain European countries such as the United Kingdom. Societally, this meant that the United States was obviously trying to keep its people quote-unquote white. This was not the first quota used by the United States, as Megan just stated, but it was very wide-ranging and very targeted in defining which immigrants were considered worthy of becoming Americans.
Inside the US, there were also many laws that aimed to keep Americans white. The Naturalization Act of 1790 declared that citizenship could be granted to, quote, any Aryan being a free white person, as stated in the podcast Saying White People. In other words, citizenship belongs to only white people. This affected societies in various ways as it minimized people who were not white because they were unable to become US citizens.
Going off of what Winnie said, citizenship laws only served to increase racial tensions and often resulted in violence toward immigrant minorities and suppressed their cultures. An example of this is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which gave those living in areas acquired by the U.S. option of citizenship. Abusive behavior broke out by white settlers against people of color. As the white population grew, the Spanish language and culture began to disappear, assimilating into white cultural norms.
Another important policy were the Alien Land Laws, the first in 1913. These were state laws that barred those who were unable to become citizens from owning land. This law was seen as a way of deterring immigrants from settling in the area. Alien land laws increasingly affected immigrants from Asian countries as well as other minority groups. Alien land laws reflected America's harsh resistance to immigrants from certain areas trying to settle in the U.S., viewing them as undesirable. Having the power to make the lives of those they deemed to be undesirable aliens difficult through policymaking, the U.S. government was able to control who could or could not be part of the country.
It is obvious that earlier U.S. immigration laws were meant to narrow the scope of who could become an American and worked specifically to deny Asians entry into both the country and the culture. As discussed earlier, under the Chinese Exclusion Act, people who even looked a little bit Chinese were denied entry into the United States, even if they were not Chinese and had never been to China. Thankfully, the repeal of the Asian immigration bar was signed in 1952 trying to help end Asian exclusion. This bar allowed Asian immigrants to be able to become American citizens legally.
Along with this, the Immigration Reform Act of 1965 abolished the equal quota system based on the national origin and established a new immigration policy based on reuniting families and attracting a new labor pool for the United States. Both the repeal and the Asian Immigration Bar in 1952 and the 1965 Immigration Reform Act show how understanding of immigration policy and the time we are shifting in the U.S. to a more inclusive understanding of the immigration policy.
The Immigration Reform Act of 1986 shifts focus from punishing undocumented workers to punishing those hiring undocumented workers. While it seems like a decent enough solution, it becomes a question of whether or not it is enforced. One recent example was with the raids in Mississippi, where 700 people were detained. The companies targeted haven't been charged with anything despite their clear violation of these laws. Things get even more confusing and contradictory when you look back at U.S. history, with the Bracero program allowing undocumented workers to work in the U.S. during labor shortages.
While much of American immigration policy excludes immigrants from society, education is one area where immigration policy in America is inclusive. Ply v. Doe in 1982 was an immensely important ruling that made it so all K-12 schools have to enroll students regardless of status. As we learned in lecture, sociologists find that K-12 education is a key aspect of integration for immigrants. Undocumented families constantly have to worry about the possibility of deportation, and Zatz and Rodriguez show how this means parents feel like they need to move their kids to different schools, often harming their education and giving them a disadvantage compared to their peers. Like how in the short film we watched about the indigenous people of the Philippines, education is power, and governments know that people are more easily controlled without education. Another step forward is the California Assembly Bill 540 that was signed in 2001. It granted in-state tuition to undocumented students. Washington and 15 other states have made this available as well. While this bill shows inclusivity to undocumented immigrants, the remaining 35 states show that the majority of Americans view undocumented immigrants that are legal adults as not part of society, even though the government provided American education for them as they grew up.
Border Patrol has jurisdiction within 100 miles of the U.S. border, including Bellingham and even Portland, Oregon. To make things worse, part of IIRIA includes 287G, which allows local law enforcement to work with Border Patrol. And since a large part of the act is expanding the list of deportable offenses and dipping into criminal history, it creates a situation where undocumented immigrants and documented immigrants distrust the police.
From 1997 through 2012, about 4.3 million people were deported. ICE had over 22,000 employees in 2013, 5,000 of which were used solely for raids and deportation. States abused their power in regulating immigrants with policies that would never be allowed in white America. ICE agents have appeared in parking lots and people's property, putting them in detention centers as if they were criminals. Targeting people in their communities shows a kind of predator and prey mindset that ICE agents can have. ICE's inhumane treatment of the immigrants at the expression of their fans shows how American society so easily dehumanizes immigrants.
Another important topic is the Latino threat narrative. While this is not a law, it does give a good account of the prejudices Americans hold that influence the creation of laws and policies. The Latino threat narrative is the idea that Latinx immigrants coming to the United States are unwilling and unable to become part of the traditional American culture. It claims Latinx immigrants are unlike other immigrant groups because the land was once theirs, and suggests that Latinx immigrants are invading the U.S. to take back their land. The Latino threat narrative propagates the idea that the southern border is not just an indicator of two countries' territory, but also a division between different races and cultures, creating an us versus them dichotomy. This fear of invasion gives some Americans justification to enact laws normalizing the use of violence by the government, such as the previously mentioned IIRIRA and the creation and militarization of Border Patrol. The Latino threat narrative shows how the negative views U.S. society holds about minority immigrants at a given time are reflected in laws and practices that permit the use of legal violence by government institutions, making it difficult for immigrants in the United States to live.